automation is not new to this space. There's actually, there's a number of people who basically have, automated systems, control systems that manage when lights turn on and when lights turn off, and, how the water flows, and even nutrient delivery. But a lot of these things are, they're very expensive. And once you have them in place, they have to be maintained and taken care of. And so there is added burden always on the, when you're putting automation in place, you're kind of trading one burden for another. It's a lever, right? You could lift the rock by yourself, or you could use a lever, but you still have to lift the rock. And that's part of the concept here is like, well, let's minimize the lifting of the rock and make it much easier for the farmer to do what they need to do.
Plant-based machine learning automation. Despite all the hype around different tech innovations, you don't often hear the words automation and cannabis in the same sentence. But Sean Deggans of Green Nanny Solutions is adamant that growers, MSOs and others across the industry are missing a trick by not leaning into the best of what tech has to offer. He tells us what's possible now and what's coming next.
Hello and welcome to this NASA-sponsored astrobiology magazine. No, it's not. It's not that podcast at all. It is the Lobster Pot podcast, and I'm Dave Barton. Sorry, I got all a bit sort of weird and digital there, Jamie. I was remembering a kind of weird podcast from back in the day that I heard that sounded like it was voiced by an AI, and it was kind of a weird Scottish AI, which... Well, actually, you're half Scottish. Have you?
I am. That's so quite bizarre. With wide reports of AI struggling to understand Scottish people. There's almost like a brutal irony there, I feel.
There is. I quite like that. A brutal irony. That sounds like that should be your second album.
My second album was really a real lackluster after the very effective first. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. But on the topic of things like AI and technology, and of course cannabis, we have our special guest today, who's Sean Deggans, who's the founder of Green Nanny. Welcome to the show, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. I mean, we've had a few good conversations, and I think what's interesting about what you do is you're kind of at this sort of nexus of sort of tech and cannabis. But tell us more about yourself, your background, and Green Nanny, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah. So I've been working in the technology space for well over 25 years. I'm one of those people that kind of started with the web when it was really a baby, and so I've worked with distributed computing. I've worked with creating mobile apps. I've been a consultant, a manager. So I've worn a lot of hats in the tech space. Right now, I'm primarily working in Azure and helping basically companies build out and build large deployments of data systems, and we're using AI and machine learning and building machine learning platforms. So there's a lot of proof of concept type work that I do in that space. But on the other hand, for the past couple of years, Green Nanny is a company my wife and I started up because we saw that there was just a lot of waste and wasted effort kind of going into the cannabis world, where we still see this, where a lot of cannabis cultivation facilities are basically running everything off of a clipboard, which is not necessarily a bad way if that's the way you kind of like to work. But the problem is the expectations from basically a legal side of, your seed and sale, tracking everything you do, basically capturing all those numbers. It really causes a massive amount of friction there. So it's great for people who are coming from the technology world and they kind of already understand how to do these things, but then they don't tend to know how to grow, good cannabis. And then you have your traditional growers who have probably been growing maybe illegally for 20 plus years, who really don't know how to kind of put the numbers together and do the things that you need to do with the computer to basically keep yourself legal. So my goal with Green Nanny has been to, hey, can I come in and kind of help bridge that gap? With consulting and services, products, and find ways to make it much easier for your growers to do what they need to do without spending a whole lot of time behind the screen. I want to be able to allow growers to spend more time with the flower. That's really the goal.
No, I think there's kind of a lot to sort of unpick there. I think, again, talking about using technology to kind of grow, essentially to monitor the progress or grow an organic plant. I think, again, can the strictures of technology and rule-based things be applied to essentially, well, I guess they can. It's just understanding what you want to get out of it it's not going to kind of grow the crops for you, but it can obviously help optimize different, tell me more. Is that kind of is that the pitch to a lot of growers? It's like, you do what you do best and let it do its thing. It.
Yeah, exactly. So you got it exactly right. It's really a matter of, what things do the grower and their assistants and, need to be able to do to work with the plant, and what things can we turn over to automated systems. Now, automation is not new to this space. There's actually, there's a number of people who basically have, automated systems, control systems that manage when lights turn on and when lights turn off, and, how the water flows, and even nutrient delivery. But a lot of these things are, they're very expensive. And once you have them in place, they have to be maintained and taken care of. And so there is added burden always on the, when you're putting automation in place, you're kind of trading one burden for another. It's a lever, right? You could lift the rock by yourself, or you could use a lever, but you still have to lift the rock. And that's part of the concept here is like, well, let's minimize the lifting of the rock and make it much easier for the farmer to do what they need to do. But yeah, that's I think probably the tough part right now is that there are some tried and true sort of known things for cultivators to do, known systems, known automation processes. Those things are in place. I think where it gets tough when it's like, well, let's say, for instance, I'm a cultivation, I'm a grower. Right. And I'm looking at AI and going, how can these things help me do a better job? How can I get more yield out of the amount of space that I have available to me? And is machine learning going to be something that can kind of help me with those things? And that's an area where you need someone who's kind of like me to be able to come in and help with that, and help build out the systems that are around that, and prove that, yeah, this is worth your time. It's profitable. And I think that's where the real tough thing comes into play, is like, how can me as a grower legitimize the expense of everything that's necessary to kind of build around these things and prove out that, yeah, it's worth the effort.
Now, you mentioned earlier about sort of compliance and things like that, but I suppose from a kind of commercial perspective as well, it must be, well, again, from what we've seen, there's a lot of people, from a business perspective, from a legal perspective, who are coming into the cannabis industry and obviously wanting to, they see the opportunity. I mean, it's a long-term opportunity. Let's not be, coy about that. But at the same time, it's, it feels almost at odds with, like, how do you commercialize, how do you a crop, and things like that. And I suppose, like you're saying, it is about all of those other elements that you can bring together. But what is it kind of holistically? What can you kind of provide them? Is it, I guess the adoption, we work in tech a little bit, in our other business as well. And we've seen companies, work with, on Microsoft Stack, they have someone come in, they kind of, bring their ERP system. So like the enterprise resourcing and things like that. And, you have the CRM, if you can kind of unite those systems together, you have the kind of opportunity for automation and things like that. If this happens, then make sure that gets sent out. And I guess in a similar way, can you do that with plants, in that, if it's this temperature, then make sure the nutrient goes in or it gets watered? Or are we talking about the same sorts of principles, I suppose? And is it a hard sell? Particularly if people who, I guess, have relied on instinct a lot, or, their own knowledge to grow stuff?
Yeah, so it is a hard sell. And it's a hard sell because, like I said, there's a lot of folks who are still very comfortable working with a clipboard to basically kind of determine, like, when did we water, when did, what's the light at? And then there's plenty of people who will say, absolutely, I'm never switching to LED lights because I've used halogen or, whatever for years and years. And and that's kind of an ingrained thing. And I call that, in the workout gym world, we call that bro science. It's this idea that, like, well, I've been doing this for years and it's worked for me. And so this is like, I'm not really interested in kind of, expanding out beyond that.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly. But on the flip side, right, when you start kind of looking at, large scale corporate farming, and this is an issue here in the United States, is that you have large scale corporate farming, which does a great job of going in and growing like a ton of crops with a lot of modifications on them, and then totally destroying the environment in the process, right? Totally like destroying the soil, and and now, again, there's obviously there's a nuanced conversation around, well, could we afford to feed the world if we didn't do these things, right? So there's complications around that. But the flip side is if that mindset now comes into the cannabis world, they're going to discover that this plant is let me just backtrack a little bit. I actually had someone who said the problem is you have to love this plant. And I think that that's where this issue kind of comes down to, is like your traditional cannabis grower. I think they love the plant. They understand the plant. They build a relationship with their plants. The corporate way of basically doing agriculture, looks at plant like it's just a commodity. I'm just cutting this thing down and packaging it up and selling it. So to get to a place where you can love the plant, but still sort of produce almost in a way like the corporate world does, but not quite as heartless, is, I think that's where the struggle is. And that's where you have to be to meet these sort of compliance needs, especially like on a state level now in the United States. We will eventually get to the federal level where there's going to have to be some sort of federal, meeting those capabilities.
I'd be really interested to get your sort of professional opinion, Sean, I guess, when you go into businesses and you're speaking to people and trying to convince them that there is a better way of doing what they are already doing. I think you talk about the love of the plant. What people do is associate that care for the plant with how they operate. So they think that working very hard at whatever the particular activity is in the growing of the plant is a key part of it, because they become attached to the whole process and everything about it that goes into the end product. So taking that away is very difficult. Now, in the little bit of experience I've had trying to bring tech into different places I've worked in the past, a lot of times people aren't even aware that there is a completely better way of doing something. I think it's very easy to go and go, well, it's obvious, but it isn't to them because they've been doing it successfully for a long time. So how do you kind of tackle those conversations with people?
Well, primarily what I like to do is focus on outcomes, right? I try and really, a lot of times I move away from the concept of even talking about the tech, but just talking about really like, what would you like to be able to do? I'm working with a client. He said it was fine that I talked about it, so I can. It's Papa Jesus Farms in Oklahoma, and he's a boutique, grower. So like he grows some really great award-winning cannabis, but he can't grow it in like great numbers. Like he can't, he's sort of like stuck at a certain level that it's difficult to scale. A lot of that is because, doing things on pen and paper and, very manual processes make it very difficult to scale. So one of the first things that we did is introduced, automated weighing, which is, in Oklahoma, they use a system that's called Metric, and that uses RFID tags to basically track everything. So we've said, all right, well, we went out to Stash Stock. I'll mention them. Picked up one of their their weight measuring systems, and we're implementing that, putting that in place, and already we're seeing like a huge time saver. And so that's why I kind of focus on. I was like, well, what do you want to do? It's like, well, I'd like to spend less time inventorying every plant in my rooms, right? I go in my bedroom, I got to go to every single plant, make sure it's there. And that takes, one of my guys like 8 hours a day to do that. So you go, okay, well, let's get an RFID scanner. We'll walk down the aisles and basically scan every single plant, and we'll have a complete inventory every time we do it. Like that's 8 hours of manual labor that's been saved. We didn't talk about the technology that much. We didn't focus on like what, how this is going to work on the back end or any of that kind of stuff. We just focused on, let's get some more of your guys' time back so that they're spending that time basically with the flower and not, going to Metric and keying in every single plant, one at a time.
It's very much avoiding, same thing we do, as marketers. We don't want to talk about features, we want to talk about benefits. No one cares that it's in the cloud. No one cares that, no one cares. What does it do? Does it make my life easier? Does it make me more money? Does it improve the quality of whatever it is I'm doing? Those are definitely the things to rail home on. And it's really interesting to hear you kind of talk about that. And be looking at the way that people bring tech into their business. Do you think that that's the big hurdle? I mean, comparing maybe the regulatory framework and climate of cannabis, it's gone from a completely illicit market to pretty well regulated, not quite as well as others, but very heavily regulated, like overnight. Whereas in other industries, it's taken decades for their regulations to kind of evolve. That jump is so kind of sparse for people who have never done anything. You know, they're not evolving with the laws. The laws are just in place. Do you think that's like a big shocker for a lot of them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially and I think some of that came from the world of, okay, it's not just marijuana, it's medical marijuana, right? So, and if you look at in the United States, if you look at like the kind of stringent requirements that are built around pharmaceuticals and delivering pharmaceuticals, those same concepts came into play here. And it's one of those, and someone asked me, well, why do they batch things the way that they batch it and blah, blah, blah. So, well, all of that basically came from, the pharmaceutical world where, the expectation is that you follow a concept that's it sounds kind of silly, but the FDA calls it basically the current good manufacturing practices. And so on the federal level, I think when cannabis does finally become legal, that current good manufacturing practice is probably going to be the primary driver for the way cannabis is packaged and manufactured. And one of the requirements of that is like consistent quality. Like, how do you get consistent quality out of a plant that, quite honestly, even though you're using clones, you're cloning a mother plant and you're consistently basically using the same plant over and over again. If you don't have your environmental conditions just very specific and on point, you will get different terpene levels, different THC levels. There's a boundary there where it's going to hit, but it's not always going to be consistently the same thing. And so that's where I think the tough part comes in, is a lot of, your growers are like, hey, I can look at it. I can look at the bud. It's huge. It's like, blah, blah, blah. It's great. It should smoke great, right? It shouldn't be like or I should be able to get what I need to get out of it. But as soon as you talk about, no, we're going to send these to a lab, they're going to get tested, and then there's a complication around that. The labs aren't testing consistently, or they're testing to meet the requirements of the, of basically like, in our case in Oklahoma, it's OMA, and so you wonder, well, as most people are, we're driven by incentives. And so if the lab is told that, hey, if this keeps kicking back like that, we're going to go do an audit, they're like, okay, well, we'll make sure it doesn't kick back that way. Right? So it's like, and so even though you're in a legal market, you may find that people are, not necessarily following the law to avoid things like getting audited or other things like that. So there's, so finding that and trying to kind of, bring people who've traditionally just basically been growing in their barn, or in their attic, or or in a grow tent in their house, and now they're trying to scale out and do it in a 3,000 or 5,000 foot facility, or even more. That's tough. Like, that's a huge, that's a big break. And even one of the growers I work with, now, I went and spent the weekend doing stuff with him, and he had spent about 3 hours going and watering plants. I'm like, dude, you know how much money you're wasting by doing that? Like, how often do you have to do that? He's like, all the time. It's like that could be automated. We could get an automated system in place to do that and save you time, so you're not in there, spending, your time basically watering the plants. But I also understand a lot of growers, they like that attachment to the plants. It's not just that they're watering the plants, they're also looking at it. They're also thinking about, all right, it looks this way, maybe I need to change the lighting. So it's not like we want to completely and totally take the grower out of the grow room. We just want to make life easier.
No, but it's like anything. They know what good looks like. They have the understanding of, is this a good crop? Is this, is this damaged? Is it going to be, they'll have an understanding of that. And it's a case of, similar to, the sort of work we do as sort of content creators, it's, it's the whole process is one of refinement to get those outputs, and it's the same with the technology. You'll keep tweaking it and twisting it and saying, okay, right, if we do it this time, this will happen. And it is kind of, continuous loop of learning, isn't it? Continuous improvement, it's
absolutely. And Davey, I think you hit something that I think is really important that I also have to kind of convey to my clients, which is, I'm not going to be able to bring in something that's going to fix your problems. Like, even if we're going to use, machine learning to do things, that machine learning is going to have to be trained specifically for your environment and your plants. As much as I'd love to say, yeah, you know what, we're just going to fly a little drone around. It's going to take pictures of plants and tell you like what their state of, where they're at. I mean, that's cool. That sounds like very, awesome technology if you have it. But the reality is we can't. I don't know, like we have to have consistent light levels. There's all kinds of things that go along with that. So it's like anything, it's a journey. It's a journey from, where you're at doing things on basically a clipboard to moving to a more automated system, which is why I'm always a little bit leery about, hey, we have the all-in-one cannabis platform that does everything for you. It's great. Sounds great. But selling it that way, like, hey, we're just going to be able to come in and we're going to fix a bunch of your problems overnight is totally unrealistic. And I think that's a lot of the message I want to convey is like, I want to be your partner in moving things along technologically, but at your pace, like knowing what your maturity level is, knowing where you need to go next, and really focusing on the things that are going to, number one, help you remain compliant, make it where you spend more time with the plant, and make it where you're not spending 24 hours a day in your business. Because that's another thing I see a lot of cannabis folks do is like they start this up and that's their life. They can't do anything outside of, working in the grow.
No, but at the same time, it's kind of that whole idea of, well, like we were saying before, they know what good looks like. They understand what outputs. But again, it's kind of like they have to kind of embrace it and think, okay, right, I understand this is going to be something that will work pretty well in the future moving ahead. So I need to future-proof the business. But also there's the kind of immediate impact, isn't there? What will this do for my crops now? What can we justifiably improve, or whether it be compliance or whether it just be whether it be all of that. It's got to have that immediate as well as kind of lasting impact, hasn't it, to really get adoption.
And I think the big selling point there is typically scaling and giving you some time back, right? It's one of those, if you're at a point where you as the master grower are the only person who knows how to do anything, you're never going to be able to scale. You'll never be able to bring on new employees, and that's where you'll hear a lot of people talk about standard operating procedures in this space. And that's where that kind of gets down to is like, well, you can't really create standard operating, I see people like, hey, buy a packet of standard operating procedures. I mean, that's kind of a cool thought. I mean, it could kind of get you started. And I'm not, not trying to knock down anyone who's trying to sell that content, because it's a helpful place to start. But don't think that like you're just going to be able to follow a book and that's going to do it for you. And I think most growers know that, right? They know that like I'm not going to be able to just buy a book and like I'm good to go and I can hand that over to an employee. But that's where that, let's bring technology in, let's bring, standard operating procedures. And I know it's a pain for you as the grower who's used to kind of doing things intuitively or from your own knowledge. But if you don't pass those things down, if they don't get recorded in some way, you'll never be able to bring in employees who, hey, if you want to go to, like CannaCon, we got, that, or, you want to go to Spain and go to a convention there, you're going to need to be able to leave your flowers in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. And if you don't, put the technology in place or the systems in place, you'll never be able to do that. You're going to be stuck in your grow all the time because your plants are totally dependent upon you.
I suppose the best place to start is with those tasks that aren't, it's always the thing for automation, tasks that aren't adding value. That's really what it is. So you can't feasibly, depending on the scale and the level of investment you have, get a machine learning model that is going to be able to identify everything about your plants. It is probably feasible, but not without an investment that is completely, outside the realm of possibility for most small growers. So it's like, what can you do that is, it's like, what's a mechanical task that we can replace that doesn't require, we know that the plants require 800 mil of water every X amount of hours, whatever it is. Those are things that you can automate and make easy and that don't need people. That's not the value add. That isn't the bit where your flair and your experience and your love are delivering value. That's just a process that you're carrying out that can be taken away.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal, right? Is like kind of looking at those kind of things and say, all right, where can we bring in, and it's not always has to be machine learning, just plain old programming. You could just say, hey, if it's dawn or dusk, I'm going to adjust the lighting, and you can do those kind of things rather easily. So it doesn't always require some really advanced technology to do some of these things. Like I said, a lot of this stuff has been around for 20 years.
Yeah.
It's not new tech.
It's kind of like a lot of business. I mean, not just cannabis, but so much is kind of, dependent of business on, what technology can offer, the kind of efficiencies and the all of that sort of thing. And it's interesting to think that, again, well, it's like any business that's kind of professionalizing, cannabis is, being treated properly. So these are kind of good problems to have for the industry, in that, it's professionalizing. There are standard operating procedures. People are taking that seriously. They're following the compliance guidelines. They're looking at that, the good manufacturing practices, all of that stuff. It's just knowing at what point you need to introduce something like technology in order to make your life easier. And it's not always from, the inside looking out, like, what do I actually need? I don't need anything. But I suppose, like you say, it's that, what's your ambitions? And it's got to always be driven by that kind of business objective, hasn't it? Like you say, and that's where you start very much, which,
Yeah, and sometimes that takes more than, a few conversations. Yes. It takes really, and for me, whenever I come in and put my consultant hat on, a lot of what I'm doing is just trying to learn, who are you as a person? What's your staff like? What's your company like? What do you love about this industry? What brought you to it? One of the amazing things about, cannabis is the various stories of what brought people into cannabis, and some of it's, just, hey, I started smoking when I was a teenager and loved it ever since, to, my mom fought cancer and it was the thing that helped get her either through it or made her, life easier, during the process. And so those kind of stories are things that, like, I love to hear, because it tells me, like, what is it? Why are you here? I got to be honest, I'm just not really all that interested. If somebody came in and said, well, we want to make the money, it's like, well, okay, you need to find a different consultant. And I know that sounds probably like,
but you've got to have heart to work in the cannabis industry. You really do. And even if you don't know a lot, you still have to have the passion for it and want to learn and accept that there are people out there who have, like you say, been doing this for decades. They understand it. They feel very fiercely proud of what they've achieved, and rightly so. And it's kind of like, you can't just come in and say, right, you guys doing it all wrong, throw it out, let the bots take over. It's just not going to happen.
It's not. And again, like, if people come in and say, well, we're here for the money, I would say, well, there are easier ways to make money. Let's say. Because again, looking at, like, the market that I'm closest to, which is Oklahoma, they're struggling right now. The price of a pound of, marijuana has dropped drastically. There's way more supply than there is demand for it at the moment. And, and some of that was mismanagement on Oklahoma's side, but, they're new to it. So it's kind of hard to be too judgmental. But at the same time, I think, when you're that will, in a certain way, kind of clear the forest. There's going to be, certain people that are not going to survive that kind of economic hardship. I would like to be able to help more of those people, kind of not, succumb to those kind of problems. I think that there's plenty of room for, people to be able to grow great plants and supply the market. But at the same time, it's not an easy market to be in. It's not as easy as making money in some other industries. It's just, so if you're here for the money, like, really, you ought to think about something else. Go start a tech startup, go do one of these other things. Cause, like, it's going to be tough here. And
absolutely. But it's that bone of advocacy. I mean, we always say this, but that needs to kind of shine through. You need to be helping people and, passionate about what it is. And it's not, like you say, even if it is about the money, it really shouldn't be, and it can't be, because there isn't any right now. So it's a kind of odd sort of catch-22. But again, I feel like a lot of that is kind of temporary, and I think, well, again, I guess in the US, it's all about when federal legalization happens, and it's the kind of when we'll be. I mean, I guess the whole situation, like, if you basically grow in one state, you can't even grow in another unless you can't take product across state lines. You have to operate in multi-state and license the brand or start a whole new business in the state next door, even though you might have California and Nevada side by side, which both legal states, but no, you can't do that. So there are lots of obstacles to business, and cannabis seems to have a very astute way of kind of finding loopholes, which is important for any thriving industry, isn't it? It's like, well, they never said we couldn't do that, so yeah.
Exactly.
There's always a workaround. That's the thing I've learned. I'm not quite resourceful and resilient people working in the sector.
Well, and I think, when you've been doing it illicitly for so long, like, certain people have, it's like they know They know ways of doing things that, but again, the goal is to get away from that. The goal is to, kill off you will always have an illicit market. Like, it's never going to totally go away, but you don't want it to be your primary source of where people are buying. And the flip side of that is you also don't want them to be cheaper. And that's part of the problem right now too, right? Is like you have some markets where, well, it's very easy to basically grow and get cannabis in this market. There's not a lot of oversight. I think New York's kind of facing that problem right now, where people are just starting dispensaries without any licensing or anything else and selling stuff from out of state. And that's a problem. That really that makes it very difficult on someone who is basically following the rules and saying, look, I'm going to start a legit company. I'm going to run it correctly. I'm going to meet all of my requirements with the state legally, and everything else. When you've got like somebody down the street who's growing pounds and pounds of outdoor marijuana and selling it for dirt cheap, $35 an ounce and stuff like that. It's just crazy. Because it's dirt. But people are, you say, well, yeah, it's 50% THC. It's like, oh, well, I'll buy it. You're not knowing any better that like it's not. It's probably 16 or 17. But they don't know any better. And that's part of the So it's a matter of like educating the consumer. And I think a lot of brands are doing an excellent job of kind of doing that, of, really focusing on educating the consumer and letting them know like the difference between what's good quality and bad quality. But it's also on the states who are opening this up to look at that and work, I think, closely with growers, cultivators, like, knowing that, hey, this is a way a cultivator works. This is our process of doing things. Let's put our seed to sale tracking system in place that actually works the way we work, and actually does things the way we do things. Instead of trying to sort of, again, I point back to like the pharmaceutical. I realize, it's medical marijuana. You want to follow some standards along, but it's also like a plant, and not, a chemical compound that I'm building in a factory into a pill, and that's a difference.
Absolutely. And I think, actually, I've got one kind of last question for you, actually. And I think you were sort of alluding to it a little bit, but I'm going to kind of sort of say, okay, right. So imagine maybe 20, 30 years from now, do you feel like potentially if AI and machine learning computing, could they make cultivation a desk job eventually? What's
so there's been a lot of conversation around it, especially on like manufacturing, right? So if we look at it from a manufacturing standpoint, it's like, well, can one person basically run an entire factory? Could it ever get to that point? Possibly, but I think what it gets down to is like, is the cost, even 30 years from now, is the cost still going to be worth the effort of fully automating those kind of processes? Now, a lot, we may see a lot change in the next 30 years. We may see a better use of energy and a better capability of using what we've got. We may see more things that are run on power. We may see more distributed power systems that aren't like here in the United States. We have a lot of these basically one large power supplier and a huge grid that spans miles and miles. We may see more nuclear power that's on a smaller scale, and it's based on different types of systems that have been used, in the last 50 years. We may see far more solar. So I think a lot of it gets down to like, what we can do with technology is going to be dependent upon electricity, and the other side, it's going to depend upon the environment. I think in 30 years, it might be too hot to even grow anything in Texas. It's a possibility, and I think that's one of the things that we or Oklahoma or anywhere here in the South, that very well could be a possibility. And so it's hard to say, could the tech, get to that point? Yes. Will the business get to that point? That's the question, right? And in my heart, I want to believe that we will always need growers. We will always need people to be involved with the machines to be able to do what needs to be done. Even as smart as machines seem to be getting today, I think we will always need a human involved, or you're not going to get good quality. I think machines are capable of doing a certain amount of things. a bit like ants. You can use ants can do all kinds of cool stuff and build things, and we'll probably see some things like that, in the future. But I think you're always going to have a human who's capable of using our imagination and our cognitive abilities, and our ability. In the number one ability I think that we have that our machine children don't have, which is collaboration. Like interoperability is super easy if you're a human. We can all get in a room and we can look at one thing, and we can build ideas around it, and we can build solutions around it. And machines are far from being able to do that at this point. They're just not there yet. They can talk to each other, but it better be very predetermined, specific conversation.
No, I think that's it's very true, isn't it? I think that applies across a whole different. Certainly in the sectors that we work in as well. But it seems like when we're still a ways away from sort of Skynet coming along and taking over the sort of cannabis world. We're not going to have a kind of malevolent AI kind of cannabis who wants to grow kinds of weird strains. Although, why not? Who knows? Yeah, it'd be interesting.
We may like the Skynet cannabis.
That's it. We heard it here first. Thank you so much again for coming on, Sean. It's been education. It's a pleasure, and it's an interesting area of work. So good luck to you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.